Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and this is a special episode. I think we're doing two in this week. As I alluded to in yesterday's conversation with Khurram, we're going to be diving deep into Nepal and the revolution there and what just happened, and more importantly, what comes next for the country. And joining me for this conversation is my dear friend and grad school roommate, Ashish Pradhan. Ashish is senior advisor to the president at the International Crisis Group, where he supports the president's highest priorities. Prior to being in this role, Ashish served as the Crisis Group's senior UN analyst and represented the Crisis Group at the United Nations. And previously, before that, he served as the group's Nepal expert, conducting research on the post conflict peace process. So, Ashish is somebody who is based in Kathmandu, understands Nepal's political economy and the various factions and the groups within the system. And nobody better than Ashish can help us understand what happened and what comes next. So, Ashish, thank you for your time today, and I hope you and your loved ones are safe and sound in Nepal.
Thanks so much, Uzair. It's good to see you after a long time, and good to have this conversation. Although obviously the circumstances could have been better.
Yeah, let's frame the circumstances, right? And we'll go into the moment or the trigger or the near term factors that led to the revolution. But for those of the listeners who haven't really followed, the violence in Nepal and the revolution itself left at least 72 people dead in 2 days of violent protests. Almost 200 were injured, according to the government's chief secretary. But a lot of the reading that I've done, in international press has talked about the social media ban and that being the trigger of the protests. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But there are always in these situations underlying structural factors that sort of have been building up for years and years, if not even decades. Help the audience understand what were these underlying factors in Nepal that ultimately collided with the social media ban and then led to the revolution and the fall of the Oli government? What were these structural issues?
I think that is the key way to look at the developments of the last week was, this is something that was a long time coming. It wasn't something that was just happening overnight. It might have been triggered by one or two particular things, which we'll discuss. But really, at the core of it was the systemic corruption and long-standing lack of trust between Nepal's political class. And by that, I mean a wide array of its political parties and leaders from across the spectrum and the population, which has seen for a number of years these leaders mired in allegations after allegations, scandals that have implicated parties from various parts of the scene, both in the government and in opposition, and a lack of accountability. And in fact, a system where it seemed like the mainstream parties were mostly functioning to protect each other from any accountability because so many of them were involved and potentially implicated in the same large-scale corruption cases. And when you have the combustible mix of these scandals going unchecked, but also an online media environment where the largesses of these politicians and their families are much more in front of people's line of sight, that's how you get the kind of popular dissent that was leading up to last Monday's protests. Now, whatever happened afterwards, especially the security crackdown that resulted in this large amount of deaths, and the pace in which those deaths happened, which was unprecedented in over a 2-day span in Nepal's history, further inflamed tensions. And I think it really resulted in the developments that unseated the KPOL government, again, within a 48-hour time span. So I think that that sense of impunity, corruption, lack of accountability was at the heart of it. And there were a few other triggers that ended up being the match that lit this combustible mix. But I think what comes next will really have to tackle this long-standing problem that the population has been really frustrated about, which is public funds being misused, the lack of any dividends for people who are forced to go abroad for employment, and a political class that seemed increasingly out of touch, especially with the young demonstrators who led these so-called Gen Z protests.
You mentioned corruption, right? And again, since most of the audience is Pakistani, this is something Pakistanis are very familiar with around allegations of corruption. But in Pakistan, at least, there's also a history of using or creating the popular narrative around corruption to undermine civilian leadership, erode trust in power, and then lead to sort of non unconstitutional interventions in the system that you and I are familiar about in South Asian history. How credible are these allegations in the context of Nepal? And has there been, was this basically the outcome of investigative journalism or things people were seeing or talking about? Like, what were the sort of pieces of evidence, so to speak, that led to this erosion of trust? Because again, in South Asia, a lot of times there's a lot of hearsay about this, and Pakistani audiences are familiar with it. So I would love for you to just explain a bit more about the scale of these allegations and how credible they were in the Nepali context.
That's a really good way to look at it as well. So in Nepal's recent political history, you look back 10 years. Since 2015, it's been the same three individuals who've rotated in the prime minister chair, the heads of three of the biggest parties, the heads of the Nepali Congress, the UML, and the Maoist Party. All three of those leaders have had really strong allegations of corruption against them. Some of them have had allegations of corruption presented in parliament. Some of them have been, again, as I said earlier, been jointly alleged to be involved in large-scale corruption cases. You might have seen in the news a couple of years ago allegations that there was a big scandal around Bhutanese refugees and a case where multiple party leaders from across the spectrum were involved in falsifying records to send Nepalis to the United States under false pretenses. There have also been cases of large amounts of gold that have been found in the Nepalese airport here in Kathmandu, which were clearly brought in illicitly, and that case also potentially implicating leaders from across the different parties. These allegations haven't risen to the level of corruption cases, carried out in leading to some form of prosecution. But what we have seen again is that there's almost been an interwoven set of allegations against each party and each leader, where it seemed like there's been mutual interest in them. It's almost like a three-way standoff, right? Where they have countervailing allegations against each other and also allegations that implicate all of them. So the perception, again, not proven in the court of law, but certainly through investigative journalism, through also some questions raised in parliament, have suggested that they've had in their interest to not only avert efforts to take these allegations to further investigations, but to protect themselves and safeguard themselves, to make sure that they themselves are covering each other's backs.
Got it. And then before I come to the social media ban and the conversation on social media in the run up to that ban, we've also seen in South Asia anti-corruption movements emerge. Years ago in India, we saw this for the last 15 plus years. Imran Khan in Pakistan has led the anti-corruption campaign as a leading politician at the very least. Other parts of the world have seen similar movements emerge when this perception takes hold. Has there been in Nepal a sort of an alternative political movement in the run up to these protests that had been encapsulated by a new leadership in the country that was talking about this corruption, or was this still a very nascent movement where Gen Z in particular, as the protests have been covered, were sort of organically talking about and criticizing this growing corruption in Nepal?
A little bit of both. So you had in recent years, certainly the emergence of new political forces, parties, and individuals in Nepal that indicated there was that the tide was turning against some of these long-standing, big, powerful mainstream parties. For instance, the current mayor of Kathmandu Valley is someone who's an independent individual, not affiliated with any parties, someone who comes from outside of the traditional political class. And he's someone who has a reputation as a bit of a populist, but also someone who's tough on corruption, who is clean in terms of his own track record, and as it was seen as someone who's represents a big sea change from these mostly septuagenarian, octogenarian leaders from these big parties. You also had in the last election here in Nepal a new party emerge, which again represented a little bit of a pivot from the traditional political party class, where they brought in a lot of people who were from the sort of technical expert community, people who had worked in quite a lot of finance sector, public service sector jobs, even individuals who've worked abroad in consulting, and were seen to bring in a lot of subject matter expertise rather than playing the traditional patronage politics that Nepal and South Asia is, usually rewards in its elections. Now, the difficulty I think there has been that there's been some amount of co-option even of these forces, and there's been a level of disappointment, I think, from those that voted for some of these new political forces to see that either they've come up against some of these structural challenges that are posed by these parties, or have exhibited some of the same types of characteristics in terms of their leaders being involved in scandals, might not be corruption scandals, but scandals relating to other issues, whether it's their background, dual nationalities, and things of that nature. And so I think that was also a congealing factor around what happened in the last week, because over these last couple of elections in Kathmandu and across Nepal, people have tried to give new parties, new forces a chance. Some of that has paid dividends, but some of it, I think, has still left people questioning, what has been the benefit to us from this political party environment, where the traditional parties clearly aren't catering to our needs, and in fact are exploiting our taxes, state resources, and new parties themselves have also not really been able to make much of a difference in that regard as well. And when you have a political constituency like Gen Z, which hasn't really been considered as a political force, and which hasn't been, has had its aspirations really addressed by the parties and by the various governments in recent years, you see the streets as the only avenue for dissent. And Nepal has a long history of street protests and movements which have toppled regimes. So they already had that blueprint. Plus, they had, something which I think has been another coalescing factor, which is looking around both in the region and beyond. Certainly looking at the cases of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh from recent years, but also what's happening in real time in Indonesia was something that I saw myself online on a lot of platforms as providing inspiration to a lot of these campaigners in the lead up to protests. So again, I think it's them losing patience with again across the political class, with new parties, with old parties, and seeing that others elsewhere have been able to make headway and get some amount of political change through the streets that first led to the campaigns and protests last Monday.
This brings me to the protests themselves, and you mentioned social media, right? I mean, even in the Pakistani election case of 2024, early 2024, we saw the symbol of the PTI being taken away. The party's candidates could not run on the bat, which is the symbol of the party. But despite that, Gen Z, late millennials sort of organized online and were able to engage with constituents in a way that there's, by all accounts, in Pakistan, consensus now that the PTI would have won that election had there been not massive rigging. So there's that tendency as well of social media being a unifying force, and a mechanism through which people interact with each other and build this kind of solidarity around issues that they truly care about, whether it's elections or anti-corruption movements, etc. Now, in Nepal, a few weeks prior to the social media ban, there were already some signs that the Oli government was moving towards this by mandating registration. And I recall even in DC having some conversations at that time, knowing full well that social media companies, especially Western social media companies, are not going to comply with that. And then there was going to be a standoff. Ultimately, the Oli government decided that it was going to go ahead and ban social media apps that had failed to register. I think four or five non-American, non-Western ones had registered. The big ones had not registered whatsoever. Um, and then the conversation that I was picking up on was that, well, the desire of the Oli government primarily was to curb this kind of dissent on social media. And as you alluded to, Nepal has a history of agitation. And in my mind, that seemed like a really bizarre and idiotic decision, even ahead in the run up to this, because social media is also, while at the same time it allows people to unify around an issue, it is also a distraction, right? If you're protesting online, there is less of a need to come out on the street. And then the Oli government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to take away that sort of valve, pressure release valve from citizens in Nepal. And then everything burst up on the street. How do you see that decision to ban social media? And was it purely motivated by this issue of the conversation around, let's say, Nepo babies online that was trending in Nepal for a while? Or was there more to it that they were trying to achieve with this ban?
So I think the way to look at it is, looking at Oli himself and his current and previous administration's maneuvers to curb civil liberties. I think that is really a core piece of this. When one of his past tenures as prime minister in 2019 included attempts to limit press freedoms, again, limits and attempts to criminalize social media posts and activity, and attempts to weaken the National Human Rights Commission. These are things that he was roundly criticized for, both domestically and internationally. And even in the lead up to the events that you mentioned, including the decision by the Supreme Court to order these social media companies to register, and I think the Oli government had the wind in its sails in a sense where in 2023 they imposed a ban on TikTok. Again, part of the reason was that the app was being used to circulate content that was in contravention of quote unquote social harmony, which is a phrase that's used a lot, I think, in countries across South Asia as a catch-all in terms of any content that's seen as critical of the government. And you also had, a few other instances where the government has been able to sort of get away with measures where, it put the foot down on civil liberties. There was maybe a little bit of discontent, but eventually things sort of withered away. And the TikTok ban, for instance, was in place for about 9 months until it was eventually reversed when, the folks at ByteDance, I think, agreed to a number of conditions, including on using the application to promote Nepal's tourism and in shores abroad. And I think that you mentioned the Nepo Kids campaign. That was something that I think sort of transverses both this issue of civil liberties, the issue of corruption, but I think also just the issue and the really depressing state of youth employment in the country. So you have in Nepal reports, credible reports, saying that about 2,000 people leave the country every day, leaving looking for foreign employment. The levels of youth unemployment are really high. The kind of opportunities available to Nepali youngsters is really limited. And you had in social media, a really rare opportunity. So just a few weeks ago, there were reports that in the past fiscal year, social media had allowed content creators in Nepal to earn about $250 million, across the board. I mean, that's unheard of in terms of the kind of opportunities that they might have elsewhere in the country. Most of them, including myself, go abroad for education, end up settling there for jobs, either in the Gulf, in other parts of South Asia, in parts of the Western world. So when you had the social media ban come into place, it was also a slap in the face for these youngsters who say, we found this one rare opportunity, but through no credit to the government, these social media apps from beyond Nepal's shores have given us this opportunity to generate income and stay in this country. Now you're closing that as well. And then, obviously, as you mentioned, the fact that this coincided with this multi-week campaign to spotlight the lavish spending habits of the children of prominent politicians and business leaders also seemed like the latest attempt to try to quash dissent and to cut this campaign off, before it really took off. And I think there was also a really real underestimation of the sophistication of Nepal's youth. So obviously they imposed this ban on 26 different social media applications on the 4th of September, but the amount of VPN usage and using sort of DNS servers to go around the ban meant that online activity, especially in a lot of forums on Reddit, Discord, were still continuing ablaze, and at a much higher level of anger towards the government, after the ban was put into place. And so they announced then the protests on Monday, the 8th of September, for the combination of these reasons, all the anti-corruption sentiment, the visibility with which the Nepo Kids campaign had really brought to the fore how mostly Gen Z individuals who were affiliated with political party leaders were living these lives that were so disconnected from most of the Gen Z youth in the country, in Kathmandu Valley, but especially outside, where the wealth disparity is just completely absurd. And then you had, this depriving of the opportunity for youth to make some ends, while staying in the country. And I think those sort of three or four factors combined to really lead to the kind of agitation that we saw on Monday.
So we see agitation, violence breaks out. By all accounts, I think in the first night alone, like a couple of dozen people are at the very least shot dead, and lose their lives. We see and hear reports of wide-scale violence and mob attacks and fires breaking out and looting happening and all of that. And then very quickly, at least from the outside, I start looking at reports, some conspiracy theories about who's doing what and that this was hijacked and organized to undermine the constitutional order. And whenever I hear something like that, I always look towards in South Asia one institution, which is the armed forces of that country. In Nepal, the armed forces historically have been, from what I've been told, a royalist institution. And so, in the aftermath of this violence, there's this sort of conversation for a couple of days in Nepal that the constitution itself may not survive, and the president may resign, and the army may step in formally, and then the constitutional order in Nepal, as it stands, may be yeah, done away with to bring back the monarchy. Help us understand those dynamics at play during these protests, and what was the scale of violence and arson in the last few days in Nepal? And was, from your perspective, have you picked up on credible reports on whether it was organized in a particular way by particular factions? You heard about jailbreaks as well, political leaders escaping from jail during these nights of violence as well. So, again, lots of misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories out there. And I would love for you to connect both the role of the armed forces there and the sort of constitutionalists versus the royalists here, and the scale of the violence that Nepal saw as the revolution sort of entered its second phase in the country.
Yeah, I think this is something I would preface by describing the information environment, which was really patchy, especially starting Tuesday when, the violence really erupted. So Monday, the protests start. 19 protesters are gunned down, unarmed protesters who had started to storm Parliament, but Parliament wasn't in session. Again, they were unarmed, and state security forces here in the capital opened live fire. And I think that the trauma from that and the 19 protesters who died there exceeded the number of deaths in the almost 3 week long large public movement in 2006, which toppled the monarchy back in 20 years ago. And I think that meant that the ante was already up the following day when people defied curfew orders and again took to the streets with an outpouring this time of anger. Um, that descended very quickly. What happened that day really began with targeted attacks on politicians, residences, political party offices, um, businesses that were affiliated with political leaders, and the government buildings, various ministries, but especially the three branches of government. All three were attacked. So the Parliament building was burnt, Supreme Court was burnt, and really large arson attacks, really symbolic images emerged from the office of the Prime Minister, with protesters, setting that ablaze as well. The scale and the pace in which this happened, and I went around town just yesterday to just survey the damage, and seeing how really big solid concrete buildings were really badly impacted. And it does raise questions about how protesters could have carried out such attacks across even just Kathmandu, let alone outside of the valley in other locations around the country so quickly. And was there any amount of anticipation, coordination? There hasn't been any credible evidence necessarily to point to any particular groups. But again, as you said, in an environment where information has been difficult to gather, in the immediate aftermath, there were a number of news channels that were offline. Some internet providers were also out of function because their servers were burnt in the attacks on public infrastructure. So the rumor mill kicked into overdrive, especially Thursday evening. There were reports that there might be, as you said, attempts to reinstate the king, bring him back, and bring back the monarchy, which was abolished almost 20 years ago, which really added a level of urgency to the discussions going on between the army chief, the president, and the protesters on the three different sides. Underpinning this certainly was a threat that whatever outcome that would be found could end up undermining the constitutional order, both in terms of an outcome that would be brought in from these potential infiltrating elements to try to reassert the king's desires to come back, or even from the protesters, the president, and the army chief himself, if they brought in too hastily an interim caretaker government without clear constitutional provisions that really underline that this is happening as per the existing frameworks and without going outside of the constitutional order. I think the risk there, even in that second scenario, where these last two state institutions that were still standing, the army and the presidency, and I think they really had to consider the implications of whatever steps they might take. So one example, that the two demands that protesters had unified around. One was to appoint an interim prime minister, and then two was to dissolve parliament. Now, seeing these demands develop in real time. I spent a little bit of time over the week on Discord servers listening to protesters, discuss what should be their agenda items. It was clear that, a lot of them are grappling with this much more quickly than they would have anticipated. In a traditional protest movement,
If I
you would
may
have had a
interrupt you, Ashish, on this, because Discord I'll come to in a bit as well, but these two demands, interim government, interim prime minister, and dissolution of parliament, are they even constitutional demands? Does the Nepali constitution allow for an unelected interim prime minister to be appointed? And what is the constitutionality of that?
So it doesn't allow for a prime minister from outside of parliament. It also explicitly bars former chief justices from serving in other positions of power. So there are these two constitutional provisions that were debated throughout the week as potentially preventing, which seemed to be the most obvious outcome, which was appointing the former Chief Justice Sushila Karki. But what ended up happening was that they found a different provision in the Constitution, which grants pretty broad and undefined authority to the president to safeguard the Constitution. And that became, I think it's Article 61, sub-Article 4, which became the sort of outcome option to allow for the president to say, this is a situation that goes beyond the traditional bounds of the Constitution, but we're still staying within it. There was a lot of speculation that, again, the risk here was that if they took a measure that went went beyond the constitutional provisions, could that open the door for others who've been calling for a return to the monarchy to say, if you're already going outside the constitution, why not bring back the monarchy? So I think that was one major inflection point. And I think the other part of this, as I was mentioning, was that for these protesters, they I think came to appreciate the implications of their own demands because they've been saying dissolve parliament. But if you were to dissolve both chambers of parliament, that would certainly go beyond the parameters of the constitution. But dissolving the lower house, which is what ended up happening, that is something that is foreseen in the constitution, right? So I think that again showed that happening in real time, protesters learning the legalities of a pretty unprecedented situation meant that they had to sort of come along for the ride. And I think it was also a sign that the Nepal army chief was able to somehow manage their aspirations, their desire for a quick political solution, and help the president also stay within the parameters of the constitution.
Got it. So you mentioned Discord. Apparently, from reports I've read, there was some Discord conversation about whether former Justice Karki was the right choice for becoming interim prime minister. And seems like from what you're describing that that conversation did indeed happen. So I believe this is the first global case of social media polling deciding the appointment of an interim leader of any country in the world. So that itself is a very interesting inflection point for the use of social media and the way in which protesters have organized and leveraged social media. I also heard, for example, that on Discord chats like, LLM, Chat GPT, recommendations on the relative strengths and weaknesses of various candidates were also being discussed. So again, the combination of artificial intelligence to ascertain who was the right fit for that job. Also interesting and something I guess somebody in international media or even Nepali media should write about because that's a fascinating use case and a major shift in and of itself. But I want to come to the new prime minister and understand her background and her priorities. From the reports I have read, this morning. There's a quote here that she says, I did not wish for this job. It was after voices from the streets that I was compelled to accept. She has talked about elections or staying in power for no longer than 6 months. Elections apparently are scheduled for March already. And she's talked about working very swiftly to end corruption in Nepal, aligned with the aspirations of the Gen Z protesters. What do you know about Prime Minister Karki? What's her background? And again, what kind of a job does she and whoever works with her to achieve this mandate or deliver on this mandate? What are the chances that they will succeed in the next 6 months, so to speak? Because again, we've seen this in Bangladesh. Dr. Yunus came in, backed by the army, a lot of ambitions and aspirations attached to that. Hasn't really fully worked out in that same way, but Bangladesh is also gearing up for elections as well. So again, very interesting sort of shift or similar shift in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and now Nepal. So help us understand who this new prime minister is and what are the chances that they will succeed in the mandate that has been given to them.
So she's an individual that has a very credible, strong reputation, from her time in the judiciary as someone who not only is a very staunch opponent of corruption, but also has the will and the appetite to, essentially go against big political leaders who themselves have either tried to limit the powers of the courts, who have tried to flaunt their powers in terms of trying to restrict civil liberties. She's someone who's taken a stand against Oli in the past as well, but also, just in the past week was seen taking to the streets, including on Tuesday when a lot of people, who were in her generation were taking shelter at home. And again, I think that forced the young protesters to really quickly learn who this person was, what her background is, is she someone who is credible and a potential safe set of hands to take the country forward into the next phase. And I think now, I certainly don't envy the task she has because you mentioned the variety of issues facing her. I think paramount will be making sure that elections happen without any major delays. You obviously mentioned the case of Bangladesh. In the case of Nepal, you have several government offices, ministries, services completely dilapidated. devastated. Again, going around town, you see the physical state that a lot of these state institutions are in. How do you get that up and running to some degree where you can chart out an electoral calendar, you know, open up voter registration, uh, have a campaigning period where the threat of political violence will once again come to the fore, and then be able to hold a free, fair, credible election that then brings in a new government that will be really seen as potentially charting out a new political path for the country, given the rejection that the last week showed towards the existing political class, right? I mean, these aren't the regular stakes for a normal election, really high stakes, aspirations that will be further sort of heightened, by these young protesters thinking that this is their moment. They really want to see a sea change and that this can't be business as usual. But how do you do that when, again, you still have the streets still, a little bit tense. The restoration of calm and order, is, I think, going to be a work in progress. Security presence, for instance, again, just around the capital is still fairly thin, but you see security, police personnel, for instance, posted outside of banks, indicating that the threat of looting and petty violence is still around. What do you do with the political parties that had to run off with their tail between their legs and go under army protection? How did they come back into the scene in terms of the elections? How do you also investigate what happened over the past week in terms of the large scale number of deaths and who's responsible for them? Because presumably that can be used to ban people from running in the next contest, right? But can you do that in this short period while you have these other issues to handle, and to do this in a way in which the desire for these young Nepali youth to get a quick change and quick dividends will have to be managed. I mean, we saw Thursday evening, for instance, one of the prominent leaders of the Gen Z protesters threatening to storm the presidential palace because the talks had been going on for too long without a resolution. It had been a couple of days, and yes,
Yeah, I
there
was
had
gonna
been
say a couple of
delays.
days does not strike me as too long, but maybe instant gratification and Netflix has changed people's perceptions of what is too long as well.
Especially when you are able to unseat a government in 2 days, right? I think naturally you think that, okay, the next step should also emerge really quickly. And now, 6 months, we're going to have a new election, we're going to have a new government. But I think the other part that Prime Minister Karki's government will have to really outline is what should be the priorities of this government versus the next government. And I think, for instance, tackling systemic corruption, it's not just a 6-month task, right? That will be something that will have to be a long-standing exercise. Can you do thorough investigations into all these different allegations and cases that have come up in recent years in 6 months? I find that very hard, right? So I think balancing that, urging for peace and calm, but also a level of patience, I think will be a really good critical mix going forward.
I think the other thing also, right, as we look towards elections in 6 months, you alluded to this in the existing political parties as well. But the reason why the system as it is runs for so long in places like Nepal or even Pakistan, right, is that patronage flows downwards into society as well. Now, it may be corruption or mega corruption at the very top, but parts of this flow down as patronage. And the political economy of these societies means that that patronage is a mechanism to win power in elections, even when they're not freely held. There's some limits to how much you can push the envelope, right? And patronage is an important tool. So now the Gen Z challenge, and I would love your thoughts on this, would be to figure out, well, how do we operate in a political economy of society in an electoral way where we have to confront this reality of patronage politics, right? I don't know much about Nepal, but just from my understanding of Pakistani politics, right, it is very hard to win an election on the ground and even a small to medium sized district because of this reality of patronage politics. Dynasties play a role. People who are each other favors play a role, like getting someone's kids out of jail at the very local level plays a big role in getting the community or a particular caste of people around aligned around you. Do you sense that the youth in Nepal have a decent to good understanding of electoral politics and the very grim realities of electoral politics in a society like Nepal, where all of these things are also very important. Because my fear is that if they don't, then 6 months later they may get disappointed again by seeing that, this is not a two-third plus majority of change, but in fact a coalition with a very strong opposition of sort of has been, so to speak, from the perspective of Gen Z, being able to, stall progress in terms of what they want to achieve because of this patronage politics.
Yeah, I think I'd certainly be remiss to underestimate my Gen Z compatriots, especially after the events of the last week. But I'm sure, they will be looking into Nepal's political history and exactly as you mentioned, really this deep-seated, really South Asian phenomenon of patronage politics. But here, the one caveat I'll mention is, I think there's also probably a need to, and this will, I think, emerge over time, disaggregate the Gen Z community in Nepal because, firstly, if you look at internet usage, certainly social media usage, there are figures that say about half of the country uses some form of social media. So the amount of penetration of these platforms is quite wide, I think, even by international standards. But how much of it is, really in the hands of the sort of Kathmandu crowd versus outside of the capital, and how much of that crowd has seen, this patronage politics firsthand, and how many electoral cycles have they been through where they've seen that, you can have a candidate that represents an amount of change, that talks a good game in terms of rhetorics, but then is beaten by the candidate promising the two critical things in South Asian elections, roads and schools, right? And I think that sort of calculation is something that I think could end up coming back again. And already you see just this past couple of days, these mainstream parties trying to still retain their foot in the door. They published a letter yesterday saying that, while they understand the gravity of the moment, they don't agree with the dissolution of parliament. There were also reports that, again, these three disgraced leaders of the three biggest parties have told that have mentioned that they won't agree to thorough investigations into the violence of the past week, especially the state violence of the past week, which already indicates that firstly they're being consulted and they're still in the mix and not willing to cede their positions just yet, and that's certainly they'll try, kicking and screaming to try to make sure that this election retains their power and influence. A lot of them have already put forward younger individuals from their parties in front of social media to say, Gen Z, we get it. Now, when I say younger, these are also people in their 40s and 50s, so not exactly Gen Z themselves, but by Nepali political standards, right? And I think they will try to probably chart out a pathway where maybe they change the face a little bit, new label, but maybe the same wine in the bottle, right? And how that will be supported or not supported at the ballots will be a big question. We have had one election in Nepal's recent history in 2008 where there was a really unexpected amount of support for a new political force, in that case, the Maoists. That was for various reasons, but I think, that represented a case where people were voting for sort of more rhetorical change. But then in elections afterwards, you saw going back to the norm of, again, voting for candidates and parties that promise to come build schools, come pave roads in our neighborhoods. And that ultimately is a big political entity in Nepal and big political force in Nepal as well. So I think for the Gen Z crowd, they'll have to reckon with this. Again, I think they will have to reckon with the political realities and pressures of Nepali politics, where there are certainly at the moment more candidates and individuals that represent the status quo than those representing change.
Yeah, and I think again we've seen something similar play out in Bangladesh as well, right? Like with an upcoming election, the BNP and the Jamaat are the favorites. In fact, in a recent university elections just last week, the Jamaat won strongly, and so I'm pretty sure that the young people who played a key role in toppling Sheikh Hasina and want a more open and liberal and secular Bangladesh are not really enthralled by the Jamaat's popularity, so to speak, even at the university level. Let's see what happens in the election. But again, that is also democracy, right? Like you may not get the right types of outcomes you want in terms of change, the way you see change, because society or the vast majority or a big chunk of society views the world differently and has different ambitions and aspirations, and could be likely that those people were not on the streets, but they will have electoral voice come elections in March. Last question to you, which again in South Asia, whenever something like this happens, is always the biggest talking point in at least domestic media, right? Which is the role of foreign powers. In Sri Lanka, this was India versus China versus the United States. In Bangladesh, Indian media alleged that the United States was very involved, led by Don Lu, who was also famous in Pakistan for regime change operation too. After Imran Khan, apparently, Don Lu went towards Dhaka and toppled Sheikh Hasina. And then you also had this view that a friendly government to India was ousted in Bangladesh for whatever reason, and lots of conspiracy theories there as well, mainly led by Indian media. In Nepal also, I at least, I don't know, you must have seen this too in Indian media, very different kind of conversation playing out about what comes next and the role of India versus China, and who are the aligned politicians that want to build some sort of Hindu Rashtra in Nepal versus those who are communists and will always be close to China. But then also some conversation about the United States embarking on yet another regime change project in South Asia as part of its broader South Asia policy. Again, I don't take any of these things seriously, but these are part of the conversation. But would love for you to help us understand the real sort of factions and their allegiances given the regional dynamics and the role that they play in Nepali politics. Like, what has been the role of these powers from what you've gathered in the different factions or supporting or propping up the different factions in Nepal? And so far, how do you see their role moving forward as Nepal goes through this momentous change?
Yeah, firstly, just to underline, I think one of my messages to a lot of people I've spoken to over the last week, which is that, what's happened here is domestically driven. It says a lot about Nepal, its politics, its political parties, but, it hasn't been about the neighbors in the south or the north, in this instance. I think, again, as I mentioned, the sort of broad rejection of the political class means that whichever government would have been in power, I think had they taken a measure like the social media ban, had they curbed civil liberties in the same way, would have faced the or similar repercussions. And we shouldn't forget that this government that was just toppled, had a very ideologically, you can say, flexible coalition of the Communist Party (UML) and the Nepali Congress, the supposedly biggest democratic party in the country, and yet the consequence was what it was. You also, I think, I was always very careful to tell people that, what this means in terms of the neighborhood and regional politics, coming down the line, is still unclear. And certainly for India, what happens across the open border with Nepal is always a matter of the highest, national security, especially in a case where, just a few months ago, there were the hostilities with Pakistan. And, just in recent months, there have been reports of Pakistani individuals who were found to be moving through the open Nepal border into India. So certainly, I think Delhi has always has its antennas up in terms of instability in Nepal and how that could be imported across the border to the south. China as well, certainly has had, really over the past decade and a half, made itself a really prominent player in Nepal's politics. And I remember from 12, 13 years ago when Chinese officials would be very coy about saying anything that could be construed as interfering in Nepali politics, to now taking a much more, let's say, casual approach in terms of public statements, in terms of public gestures and maneuvering. And certainly the Oli government was understood to be a bit closer to the north than the south. You will have seen Oli himself was at the SCO summit just a few weeks ago. He was due to be traveling to New Delhi, in fact, just later this coming week, after a lot of attempts to try to visit Delhi on an official visit had been rebuffed. That visit was actually called off just in the days leading up to the protests, because you might have seen that the understanding between India and China to thaw relations included a provision to resume trade in this contested area on Nepal's northwestern border, which also touches on, I think, disputed territory between India and China. And so that meant that the disputed border issue, which was a feature of Oli's foreign policy in one of his previous administrations, which he really used to rile up anti-India sentiment and win some public support within Nepal, came to the fore again. That those sort of regional dynamics and tensions are what they are for sure. That plays a part in terms of how the neighborhood views various governments in Nepal. Certain parties, again, are seen to be closer to New Delhi, the Nepali Congress, historically, for instance. But again, in this case, the broad rejection of parties across the spectrum means that this wasn't really aimed at unseating a government that was popular with China to bring in a government that will be more favorable to India. This was a rejection, right? And I think in a way, there are big questions about what this means for the multi-democracy model, multi-party democracy model that was brought in 1990. But that's something that, again, I think will be a little bit clearer depending on what happens with this transitional period, how these mainstream parties try to regain some credibility and trust. And also, I think what will be important is for the neighborhood to really look at what's happening in Nepal as Nepalis themselves charting out their own path. And what my message has been is they should see where Nepalis will want support. So, for instance, in carrying out elections, maybe they'll want international independent observers to ensure amount of credibility, but they might not want other types of support. And certainly support from neighbors in Nepal can be seen as coming with some amount of baggage. So they'll have to toe that line carefully. What I was encouraged by was the oath-taking ceremony of the Prime Minister included a lot of the diplomatic representatives of these countries in Nepal, which I think was a signal to say that no one should be confused. We recognize this government and we will engage with this government, and they'll be our interlocutors. I had spoken to a couple of ambassadors here again in the days leading up to the announcement of the interim administration, and they were waiting for their discussions to resolve so that they can then start engaging with the new administration to see what the needs are, what they would like. But their mood was that we shouldn't be leaning forward because this is a moment for Nepalis, and I think that is the right approach to take.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think in a lot of these societies, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Indonesia, you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of domestic churn, generationally, economically, politically, that's happening. And it's quite simplistic to sort of frame this in the regional rivalry of two powers, India and China in the case of Nepal, or the US and China in the case of places like Indonesia, etc. I think it sounds great on mainstream media. It can get people riled up to who are already attuned to thinking everything about everything in the form of conspiracy theories. But by and large, as you've excellently elaborated, like these are very domestically driven events, and it's important to understand them and appreciate the churn and the change that is going on, and the ambitions and aspirations of not just Gen Z, but I would even argue late millennials, right? One of the things I frequently point out to people in my conversations on Pakistan is that in the next 10 years, the average Pakistani will be somewhere in the range of 30, mid 30s years of age, right? And that's when you have a couple of kids, your parents are aging, if your grandparents are alive, their medical needs are going up. And if life sucks economically and the government has been seen as being failing to deliver on your ambition and aspiration, well, that's a toxic mix. So it's not just graduating college and coming out of college and not having a job. But in my view, at least, it's a lot more triggering, as we've seen in places like Egypt, when you're in your early 30s, late 30s, maybe going about to start a midlife crisis. You have got a couple of kids, you can't put them in a good school. Food is expensive, petrol is expensive, energy is expensive, pharma bills are going up because your parents are aging. Well, that's really the time to really be concerned about stability as well. So I think it's both these things coming together, and we've seen in Nepal that that's driving a lot of the churn as well. Ashish, thank you so much for your time today and for really excellently laying out the details of what happened in Nepal and what comes next. Again, stay safe. I hope that this next few months goes by safely and securely in Nepal, and again that there is an electoral process that stands up to the ambitions and aspirations of Nepali citizens, particularly its youth. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Uzair.